Welcome to the next in our series of online lectures for the history of modern Asia. Today we are going to be talking about China's nationalist revolution. In other words, how does China go from being a monarchy, an empire, to becoming a republic? So let's get to it. We're going to begin our story in the year 1900. By 1900, foreigners were growing increasingly unpopular in China. This was largely due to a century of imperialism and colonization, as Western nations had seized ports and cities within China as colonies. The Japanese had also recently gotten in on the act after the Sino-Japanese War, and so they were also unpopular within China. Essentially, this is leading to a backlash against foreigners within China, and that backlash is going to be led by a group known as the Boxers. So who were the Boxers? Well, the Boxers was a name given to an increasingly radical group of young, very traditional Chinese people. The Boxers were anti-foreign and they were anti-Christian. They also started to develop some mystical beliefs of their own. They came to believe that through proper study they could become possessed by the gods, and therefore, if they had the spirit of the gods within them, they would be impervious to bullets. The Qing dynasty did not know how to react to the Boxers. On the one hand, the Boxers hated the Manchus, referring to them as foreigners, just as they referred to the British and the French and the Japanese as foreigners. On the other hand, the Boxers were growing more and more popular among the population. Thus, the Manchu were very slow to condemn their growing radicalism. In June of 1900, the Boxers besieged the foreign embassies in the Chinese capital of Beijing. The British sent in troops to aid the diplomats, and this led the Manchu, or the Qing, to ally with the Boxers. By August of 1900, an international force of 18,000 British, German, American, and Japanese troops marched into Beijing and defeated the Boxers in battle. Now this restored order in the capital, but then these foreign troops proceeded to plunder the city. In other words, they basically took their revenge on the population. Now, no surprise, this action did nothing to quell the anti-Western sentiments in China. Nor did this help repair the reputation of the Qing. By 1905, the Qing will be forced to give in to some limited reforms within the Chinese system. I'm just going to go through a few of these reforms, but I hope you notice that many of these mimic or at least follow the pattern of what was happening in Japan at the same time. One of the major reforms will be to the Chinese education system. Traditionally, students in Chinese schools had been educated by forcing them to memorize long passages from Confucius. Now, that didn't really prepare these students for life in the real world. Therefore, a modern curriculum will be adopted, a modern curriculum that will focus upon science education, the study of foreign languages, ethics, world history, and international affairs. These will now be the focus of Chinese education. Essentially, China is attempting to bring its schools into the modern world. Another group that will benefit from this reform movement will be women in Chinese society. And the most obvious benefit to women will be an end to the practice of foot binding. Foot binding was something that was most common among the upper classes in Chinese society. For centuries, Chinese men had prized women with tiny feet. Thus, a practice developed of binding a young girl's feet to prevent them from growing. You can imagine this was an incredibly painful process, and for many women this actually turned into a handicap. Many of these women, by the time they became adults, could barely walk. Along with an end to foot binding, there will also be calls for educating women. Remember, in Japan, another one of the great reforms in Japan was allowing girls to go to school. The same thing is going to happen now in China about 20 years later. Women will be allowed to get an education. Women will become more involved in society. They will become involved in business and in political groups. So again, this is another great reform, another great change in Chinese society. Other reforms will include the spread of elected assemblies that will have the power to at least make some laws for the people of China. There will be greater press freedom as newspapers spring up across the Chinese state. Young people in China will become more involved in politics, more involved in society. That's another great change in Chinese society. Moreover, China will follow the example of Japan by modernizing its army, modernizing its navy, trying to develop the military of a modern power. Now, these reforms will be limited. For example, the elected assemblies will be only chosen by a small fraction of the Chinese elites. However, this is an improvement. More and more, we're seeing China following the same path that Japan had followed 20 to 30 years before. The man who will take over leadership of the Chinese reform movement is a man named Sun Yat-sen. Sun Yat-sen, as you can see on here, lived from 1866 until 1925. He was educated in America. He actually, when he went to, he lived in Honolulu for some time. Unlike many other Chinese folks, he was also a Christian. And he also, as I said, was a very educated man. He was, in fact, a doctor. Sun Yat-sen and his involvement in the reform movement in China will lead many today to refer to him as the father of modern China. Sun's first foray into Chinese politics will occur in 1895 when he will launch a coup attempt. In other words, he will launch an attempt to overthrow the Chinese government and turn China into a republic. He times this revolution for 1895, shortly after the Sino-Japanese War. There is great outrage over China's defeat in that conflict. Many are questioning the mandate of heaven, and so therefore Sun believes he has an opportunity to overthrow the emperor. It fails, and Sun will be forced to flee the country. He will first go to Japan, and then later to the United States. Still, he will never give up his dream of leading a reform movement in China. In fact, even while living in exile in the United States, Sun will continue to plot against the Qing dynasty. He will announce what becomes known as the Three People's Principles. And these are principles that he believes reflects both modern thinking and an anti-imperialist attitude. The first of the Three People's Principles will be people's nationalism. And essentially, to put this very simply, people's nationalism simply meant an end to imperialism. The second of his principles will be people's rights, which simply means he believes China should become a democracy and that the people of China should have a right to elect their leaders. The third of his people's principles is the people's livelihood. And this is, he wants to use the government essentially to redistribute land within China so that it is more fair, so that wealth is distributed more fairly within China. As it is, China, most of the wealth is held by just the aristocracy. He wants to spread this out so that more people have an opportunity to make a living off the land. Calls for reform across China will continue to grow stronger as we reach 1911. Ultimately, revolution will break out, and Sun will return to China in 1911 and ultimately will be elected president of the newly declared Republic of China. With the declaration of the Republic of China, the 6-year-old emperor, Puyi, will be forced to abdicate his throne. Yet Sun will be unable to sustain his power. Within a year of his election, he will be forced from office by political opponents. Revolution will break out across China once again, and China is about to enter another period of instability, a period now known as the Warlord Era.